cloud native EKS or native clusters. We'll go ahead and we'll just talk about some random stuff while everyone starts joining in. So, hey Chris, what games are you playing lately? What's taking up your time? What are you doing in your spare time?
What am I doing in my spare time? I have attempted to get going in Gran Turismo 7. It's a hard game.
Yeah, I
Like, I just don't have those motor skills. But then I think back to when I was in high school and I was playing like Gran Turismo 1 and 2. I still had the same terrible skills. So I feel like I haven't at least degraded my gaming skills. Um, Ghost of Tsushima, I think, just consumed most of my life for like February, March, April, May.
oh wow.
Became really focused on finishing that game. Brilliant game. Very good on the
Elden Ring
PS5.
or anything too, or I'll say for like the racing games, it's like 5 minutes of me trying to not crash into the wall, and then it's me turning around and just going the opposite way, and then I'm just done. So that's like I'm not very good at racing games.
You're in the arcade playing Daytona.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the old NASCAR, like when the first like PC NASCAR Daytona five was it Daytona 500 that came
I think
out?
it was Daytona 500. Yeah.
Yeah. Just crashing, turning around. I was awful at racing games. I can't. I don't have the dexterity or the idea of when to brake and then when to turn. I just full speed through a corner and then just right in the wall.
I'm not getting in a car with you. Um, no way. No way. If you come down here to San Jose, I'm driving. Um, I'm not willing to take that risk. For people that are just joining in,
Yeah.
this is actually a discussion about Kubernetes.
Yes.
Mike and I are just giving people some time to wrap up their previous meetings before we sort of jump into the meats of our session. Um, in the meantime, we're shooting the breeze. Mike, I think you're going to have to perfect your introduction.
Yes. So let me introduce everybody. All right. So we got Chris Jones, director of product at Platform Nine, and I'm Mike Petersen, technical marketing engineer. So we do Kubernetes stuff and cloud native things. This discussion is going to be kind of about learning about Chris and then diving into the topic, which, like I said, is EKS versus native clusters. So we'll talk about it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Like we're monitoring chat and stuff too, so we can respond. But let's go ahead and
Yeah.
pass it off to Chris and go and get started. Say, okay, so how did you get into tech and what moved you into product management? Like how did you make it there?
How did I end up where I am today? Um, first off, I am Australian. I live in America now, and moving here is how I got into product. Um, how did I how did I get into working in the world of technology? Um, I would like to say path of least resistance. I I went to RMIT in Melbourne. I did a degree in psychology. I did a degree in essentially computer science. Um, if you want to do anything with a psych degree, you kind of have to do a honors year and then go on and do like a master's or some type of like 2 year clinical training or even a PhD. I was a bit sick and tired of being a broke student, so I decided let's use the other degree I have, see if I like the world of technology, IT, and if I don't, I'll go back and get a master's in psychology and use that. I was very interested in video gaming addiction, which RMIT circa 2007 told me that's not a real thing. People can't get addicted to the internet and video games. I guess
That's changed, I'm sure.
history
Probably.
history has proved them wrong. So yeah, I started working at a bank in Australia. I worked with a platform called BMC Patrol that did all of the monitoring. I looked after BMC Remedy, which is a help desk platform, and an automation tool called AutoSys that basically made the bank run. Like all the transactions, all the reconciliation, all the automation that people run in cron jobs in Kubernetes today. That was all done by AutoSys and Control M, um, which really kickstarted my career looking at the the broad spectrum of everything in an environment, which is kind of a unique way to start a career. Then spent the next 10 years living in the world of application performance management,
That sounds
which,
awesome. So did you
yeah.
start out as a Linux person or a Windows person?
Oh, I'm a Windows person. I
Okay.
started with Mac as a kid. I mean, keyboard and mouse was just what I grew up with. Um, yeah, I like a graphical user interface. I like a GUI. I like to drag and drop stuff. Um, I lived in WinSCP if I ever had to do anything. But that said, if I was architecting a system for my prior product, Foglight, I would push people to run it on Linux because it was more stable.
Yeah.
Right? It was just the better back end operating system to run the app on. Yeah.
So you had PuTTY installed, but now you can just use the Linux subsystem, right? So you can SSH using that instead. Or do you still? Well, now you're using Mac, so you're not using a
No,
Linux
mate, I
desktop
don't have a
for
problem
gaming.
now. Yeah,
All
I
right.
don't think I've used Windows for like 4 years.
So do you think your background in application, you said application, what was it? More monitoring and then also productivity slash.
It was all, yeah, all, I think back in the day, you could say APM encompassed all application performance monitoring.
So do you think that's the
100%.
way you're making products now, or?
Yeah, because you have to understand the the entirety of what an application runs on, right? You can't just look at what a JVM is doing without understanding that it's talking to a SQL database that's running on some NetApp storage. And the problem about the app being slow isn't the app or the actual query to the database. It's the fact that database is sitting on a file that's being clobbered by everything else in the environment. So you have to holistically look at that entire environment. And, the last thing I sort of did when I was still at Quest Software prior to Platform 9 was introduce monitoring for Kubernetes. And everyone was like, well, why is this so much more complicated? I'm like, well, it's smaller things, there's more of them. It has a higher rate of change. And people are probably going to run this on virtualized nodes in their data centers. All of a sudden, you have contention in the cluster. You have contention on the VMs that are running the cluster, contention on the hypervisors, and if you are doing persistent storage, the persistent storage underneath.
So that'll get us into the topic eventually. But let me, I'll ask you one more question about your background. So, like, what's your goal when you're building a product, right? So you've had a chance to really like build out a product here. What are your goals? Like, do you start thinking like what would make it easier for the user, and then do you start demoing different things that you want to bring in, and test them out? Like, do you just test a bunch of different stuff and say, okay, this is the easiest to use, or this is the most useful, and then bring it into the product, or what do you do?
Oof, that's a tough question. Always start with the market problem. I think there's a great model out there. I at least was introduced to it by the Pragmatic Institute. Is it a problem? Is it pervasive? And the golden third question: are people willing to pay for it? If you don't get a yes on all three of those, don't progress. Because if it's not a pervasive problem, your market's going to be very small. If people aren't willing to
Yeah.
pay for it, then well, you're not going to get anywhere, right? Everyone's running a business to make revenue and earn a profit, so we can all have jobs and be employed. So that's always like the foundational thing. I think the part about building a product, launching new products, adding new services, changing features, it's all about that pain that users are feeling. Like how's it impacting them? Where is it impacting them? And then how does that propagate across the industry? How does it more broadly apply to more than just one business? I think it's a very easy trap for people to fall into. Is to hear a number of customers say, "Hey, I've got a problem with my network latency." Let's use an example. Um, let's We need to fix that. So you start looking at latency as opposed to taking a step back and saying, all right, where is this impacting your business and how is it happening? And how does it fit more holistically into your infrastructure, your application design? And saying, well, and importantly, how did you get there? Where are you going? Because as soon as you sort of broaden that perspective, you can actually see that their whole reason for hitting it might be a bad design decision. So it's a problem that's on their journey, but because we in product or solution engineering, solution architects, consultants, you get to hear and see more ways of something being solved. All of a sudden, you can suggest, hey, have you looked at this alternate path? So you might be able to fundamentally avoid fixing something that's not actually a problem. It's just a manifestation of a different issue. Or you're able to see a pattern that's occurring and actually design a better solution to get people where they're wanting to go instead of focusing on this myopic issue, right? I've got network latency. How do I solve for that? There's many ways you could solve for that. Where are they going, right?
Well, say so. The
It's
interesting thing about you too is I think you're more of you're a technical product manager too, to where you like to get in and install things and demo stuff and like try to figure it out, right? Like so, you're not just like managing what's going on. You're like, oh, I'm going to install Argo. I'm going to install X, and I'm maybe I'll like write about it, but I'm going to try to learn about this thing to see if it's useful. Do you enjoy doing that still? Like, do you get as much time to do that, or like what's your favorite thing that you've been playing around with lately?
if I'm doing a job interview, I don't talk about any of those skills. I hide it completely.
Yeah,
When I was in consulting, I didn't say I could write software ever, ever, right? It was just like this. Oh, that's convenient that you can do that because then you're at a customer side. It's like, all right, I'm going to script this thing, right? I'm going to do this weird PowerShell vSphere script to get some extra metrics into a monitoring product. Um, I think it's just out of pure curiosity. I need to know how it works or where it's going to go. I want to be able to have an informed conversation with my users, my designers, my software engineers that are building these things. Otherwise, it's like this case of everyone trying to dumb down or abstract or articulate to you their problem, but they can't use the words that would best enable that conversation. So I think it's paramount. I think if you're a product manager, you need to understand what your product is doing, how it's doing it, and have a level of understanding of how to use it. Right? Otherwise, when your users come to you and say, "Hey, it's not working,"
yeah.
and that standard response of, "Well, it's working as we designed it," right? That every product manager has said, and every other person in the world is like, "Well, that's a rubbish response." You aren't able to say, "We designed it to do X, Y, Z," and you've introduced step N.
Well, do you think that makes it easier for you to sell it to like stakeholders? Like, hey, we should add this because this, and then when they ask questions, you can just answer it. Like you've got the CTO or something in there asking you, well, why, right? Like, can you sell it a little bit better because of that? Do you think?
I think you can definitely articulate that broader. We're solving the problem you're facing by doing this step.
Yeah,
It enables that conversation. So, what am I using right now? What I'm playing around with? Argo CD. Um, we've talked a lot to the market about just templating whole clusters, and we looked at, well, what is a good engine or a good vehicle to help enable that to happen? And along that journey, discovered Argo CD, and that whole community. And I think it's absolutely fantastic that if you're doing cloud native and you're looking at really truly seeing those benefits in agility, um, you need some type of continuous deployment engine, and Argo is an incredibly good solution for that.
so why is it Argo CD time now instead of like 2 or 3 years ago? Like, has stuff advanced to a point where like it's just easier to use it now? Or I know we're talking
I
about
mean,
EKS. I'm just
we're a
trying to
great
get.
GUI, which helps me immensely, right? I'm not going to lie. Looking at other tools out there, I'm like, well, if I have to use command line, my learning curve is significantly higher. But then that also means, right, I'm building tools to help businesses all around the world, not just in the Bay Area or really, really technical folk, right? There's a lot of people out there that are great at their job, but if the learning curve is extreme, like it is for Kubernetes, they're just not ever going to get there in a viable time. So, I mean, the GUI helped with Argo CD. But the thing with Argo and other tools like Flux that are in that generation of continuous deployment is they were built for Kubernetes, right? Harness, if we would pick a tool out there that works on the sort of broader spectrum of infrastructure, um, it will do CD with VMs, for example. It also has cool Kubernetes capabilities too. But Argo CD, open source, built just for Kubernetes. So why Argo? Well, it was only open sourced. Recently it's still an infant in terms of a product life, and it's exclusively built to work in a Kubernetes environment, which means
Do you,
it's aware. It's able to life cycle those assets much better
do you
than.
think that a couple years of Helm development have made it a little bit easier too? Like it's on what version 3, and maybe it's a little bit easier for templating out, and they've kind of fixed some of the stuff in the first two versions, like no more installing what tiller.
Till was definitely a problem, right? One of the first releases of Kubernetes of PMK, the Platform 9 Kubernetes service, we had to have Tiller installed, and that made doing Helm a pain. So when we launched our free platform, we actually ripped it out and then replaced it with version 3, which has simplified the entire process. If I'm getting in there into the weeds about CD, I think Customize has a lot of cool features, and I'm really just sort of getting into that. Um, I think it's got a lot of powerful ways to help you sort of templatize your manifests. Um,
Gotcha. All right, so
yeah.
let's move into the topic now, since we discuss everything. But so why would okay? So the topic: why would you build and run a Kubernetes control plane right now? Like, why would you do that? Is there a benefit? Like, what do you think?
What do I think? So
So
we
let's start
support.
with the native clusters before we go to EKS, right? Like, why would you
Yeah,
go native? And
let's level set for everyone that's joining in. We're trying to figure out a way to label clusters where you build the control plane, and then clusters where you're consuming a service. So EKS, AKS, and GKE. So I use the nomenclature of a native cluster. It's just native to Kubernetes. You're running the control plane. So you'll see in our documentation, we'll talk about like a native AWS cluster. Um, why would you do that? Let's say you're running a hybrid cloud, you're on premise, and you want like for like clusters, 100% identical. Well, unless you're going to go down the path of doing EKS anywhere and running that or running the EKS distribution yourself, and then you still have to figure out the control planes in your data center, right? And etcd management. Um, that will give you consistency. So if you want the same API server flags, control flags, scheduler flags turned on in both environments, then that's your only option. You have to run a native cluster in a hyperscaler or any cloud or colo that you're running in. Um, that would be the first and most prevalent. Um, the other one that I sort of see is for people that are living at the bleeding edge or just want to play around with all the cool widgets and features is the ability to customize that control plane, to really fine tune things for the ways that you want Kubernetes to run. That obviously introduces a world of new complexities. You could be doing things that the community is not even sort of keeping pace with. It's like a new feature that's getting introduced. It could be alpha or beta, and you want to try it out. Is it going to help with your application and infrastructure architecture moving forward? Um, that's another great reason to build a native cluster and operate those control plane nodes yourself.
so we're talking about like the control, like there's two ends, right? Like there's one end of like what's the lag time for EKS on Kubernetes version, and what is the lifetime of support on older versions that you may want to keep running for specific reasons? Like you've got everything built out that uses a specific version of an API that hasn't changed for Kubernetes, or like you might want to use like an old version, like a couple years old or something like that, because you don't want to change, or you've got a contract that requires it. What's the benefit there? Like what's the lag time, and then are there benefits to running older versions and doing your own control plane if you have to?
I think I think running older versions is a bit of a dangerous game to get into, right? Um, Especially with security, you want to be able to get security patches. Um, there are ways out there to get a vendor to support older versions, um, but once again, the whole point of being cloud native is to have that agility, right? To have that speed, to have that execution capabilities. So I would definitely encourage people upgrade. Um, if you are doing a native control plane, then yeah, you can pick and choose. Definitely a lot more. Um, if you look at EKS, it's got versions it supports, right? We're releasing full EKS lifecycle support in the next couple of weeks. And when you go to build an EKS cluster, you've got to pick a very definitive version. If you're rolling your own, maybe using kubeadm and building it, you're just going to be able to pick what you want, minor or patch. So you're right. You do get that flexibility. Um,
You say so. Some of the downside plus some of the upside is being able to use cutting edge or like something that's just released. But then it's also, are you worried about using something that's like release 0.2 or 0.7, like maybe something like Metal LB, which, or even like KubeVirt or something like that previously, which are just these new projects that you can use them and everything, but they're not to the 1.0, right? Like people were using Istio before Istio became 1.0. Um, and they were using it in production, right? Like so.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to, right? You want the capabilities, so you just sort of make that decision and do it, right? We run KubeVirt in production for customers, right? We run Metal Cubed. Everyone was using the batch API, and if memory serves me correctly, that was running in beta for a pretty long time.
So like, is there what? So I guess when we get to the EKS, like, what's the downside slash benefit of being able to run Metal LB and get the new updates and stuff versus using like a service from Amazon for like their load balancer service and just relying on them for EKS? I guess we can move into EKS. Like, why would you use EKS?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, if you're in the cloud, use those cloud services. You want what AWS I think called it very well and put it in the product names. You want the elasticity, right? You might have extra costs from operating in the cloud, but there's definitely a level of agility and elasticity that you get. You can expand and contract more. If you're in a data center, it's very hard. You can't turn around to Dell and be like, "Hey, take those servers back today. I want them tomorrow." Now they're moving to subscription models. That's a different story. But if you've only got 100 servers installed, you can't magically invent 10 more. Right? Someone has to come, rack them, stack them, plug it in, do the networking, provision it, install the operating systems if you're doing bare metal. All the reasons why we're doing Metal Cubed in the data center and at the edge is to automate that provisioning. So if you're in the cloud, you don't have to worry about any of that. If you're doing, even if you're doing a native cluster in AWS, you should be using their autoscaler and getting the benefits of being able to drive that elasticity. You should be using, classical network load balancers for, your control plane endpoint, for example, or when you deploy a service that's using a type of load balancer. You want to leverage those cloud capabilities because that's going to fit in with all your other services. Let's say Cloudflare, that's external. I would never really encourage anyone to go down the path of putting Metal LB in a cloud, especially Azure. It's got some fun networking requirements.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in EKS or AWS, you want to leverage them for their strengths and not create barriers between where you are, where they are, and what you can get from that, for sure.
See, some of the benefits maybe of running on-prem and using something like Metal LB2 is it's an open source project, so I can go in and create features if I want them, or at least propose features and get them adopted. Whereas maybe something on EKS is going to be more opinionated, like if I'm using their just native ingress that gets deployed with the cluster, or if I'm using their load balancing, like it's opinionated and I have to do whatever they say. But if I want to do something special that they're not going to support, or maybe it'll take too long to support, I can get involved in open source, right? So Metal LB is getting the feature sets close to what you can get in a provider.
Yeah,
I guess that's another beneficial of native or on-prem. We're talking about on-prem. Native. You're saying use their stuff.
So yeah, I mean, if you go native in a cloud, I think I would strongly encourage you to leverage their services. Like you're going there for a reason. Otherwise, I think you're just creating a Frankenstein that's going to be a bit painful to operate, especially on the network layer. Right, you're going to have to create rules and policies inside of AWS that are outside of the cluster that allows connectivity to flow correctly.
So say I'm trying to figure out. Oh, I want to move to containers. I want to move to Kubernetes. I don't know what I'm doing. What is the easiest way to get started if I don't have hardware? Moving into like, why would you use EKS or something like that? Would I use EKS? Should I jump in there? Like, what if I don't have anybody that's using Amazon and are used to the account management and that kind of stuff? Like, how big of a hurdle is it to get started after you've just deployed the cluster and give permissions to everyone? And
well, I mean, that piece you just sort of glazed over there, I think is the complexity. Right, EKS is a fantastic service. It gets you up and running. That cluster comes, batteries included. There's storage. Awesome. That means you can deploy persistent apps. You don't have to go around and set up storage classes. The CSI drivers are installed. Once again, all connecting through into those AWS services that allow you to move really quickly. Ingress, it's there. Load balancers, are there. If you were to go the route of, hey, I can run a VM on my laptop, let's give Platform 9 Bare OS a go, you'll have to bootstrap in storage, right? You're going to have to figure out a way to do that. You're going to have to learn about load balancing. So if you want to learn fast, the easy way, go EKS. And I think there's a lot of users out there that sort of done EKS. They go on-prem, they start doing something, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, there's all these things I just never knew about because they were just provided. I started learning just using virtual machines in our cloud that we use internally. So I had to build it all out, bring it all together, go and create like subnets to give to MetalLB so I could have a service exposed and I have to use node port or proxy and figure out all of that stuff, which I think are good things to learn about. If you're going down the Kubernetes world to go cloud native, you need to know about these concepts. Otherwise, at some point in time, you're going to hit them and be stuck. But EKS, they're all pretty much solved. But I think one of the biggest hurdles you're going to face almost instantly is identity and access management and distributing kube configs to people so they can actually access the cluster.
I think that on-prem, right? Like day one, like, oh, I've got Kubernetes installed. And then you try to run your first like thing to show off like how it works, and it doesn't work because everyth's using a load balancer, like all the examples and stuff. And you're like, oh. So
yeah, because they're all built for the cloud.
Yeah.
Right. Google's done a great job in providing the community a lot of really worthwhile like services and examples and microservices apps. The Artifact Hub and all those Helm charts out there. I'm just going to try Let's try WordPress. That's a great thing. It's a Helm chart. Click go. It'll deploy onto an EKS cluster. But as soon as you start doing something yourself that doesn't have, let's say, there's no storage class, yeah, you're done. But then you have to learn, right? So what do? You're learning command line. I've already expressed this. I love being able to see and not have to type 1,000 commands to like visualize in my head what's going on. If you're getting started with EKS, you definitely want something that's providing you that graphical user interface into the cluster, whether it's the Kubernetes dashboard and installing that into the cluster once it's up and running, or importing a cluster, something like Platform 9 or other services out there that let you see what's going on.
So you think there's people out there that have like just deployed EKS are like, oh, this is easy, and then they let's do it on prem, and then that's like you're saying, they have to learn all these things. So it's a good gateway, but then as soon as you start doing stuff, like, oh man, there's all this stuff I don't know, right? Like, and there's so much more to learn. So I guess not having the people to be able to learn that means that using something like EKS could be a easier and faster way to get your developers running. But then it comes at a cost, right? Like there's going to be a cost associated with everything you do.
Yeah, I mean, and you're still going to have to ask the community for questions, right? How do I upgrade? What's the best way to test for that? How do I know what the API changes are? Right, I've talked to a lot of customers out there that literally build a new environment on the new version of Kubernetes, deploy all their apps, see what breaks, and then fix their apps, and then upgrade. But let's say you've been using cron jobs, you were unaware of it went from beta to JA, you just didn't see that. That's not going to be a fun upgrade. All those manifests need to be changed. So you're going to have to contend for that. Who's helping? Though that's definitely not AWS's job, right?
Making sure that something else hasn't changed in there, like a line isn't different. So you're doing a bunch of troubleshooting. You're trying to deploy it, and it just keeps spitting back out, this is wrong, or this field is wrong.
Another reason to adopt Argo CD and GitOps, right? I like to say the big thing about Kubernetes that fundamentally changed, I think, the way that at least large enterprises look at these things is, I feel like it kind of joins infrastructure and applications together, like fundamentally, just like sticks. I remember troubleshooting JVM issues, and we're all like, right, it needs the VM that RAM needs to be dedicated, because the way that the JVM is expecting it to be there is it's not a shared resource. And you got these VMware admins going, oh, but we can't do that. That's not going to give us the benefit of running a virtualized environment, right? We can't like over allocate things. It's like, yeah, but you've got your entire business running on Java applications. You're over allocating the RAM, and then you have a thing that's inside the VM that's taking behavioral actions, assuming it's got a physical resource, and that's causing your slowdown of performance. Therefore, your loss of revenue because no one can sign up. It's taking 5 seconds to respond, and they just leave. Or your checkout's running slow, and they think it's broken, so they just go buy the book on Amazon.
So
Right?
they were thinking about like VMs. They're thinking about VMs in the way that most people would think about it, but they were doing it differently. Like usually you would think, okay, this VM might have like someone using it 30% capacity at this time, and then there's going to be different people using it at different times, but they're like 100% hitting it the entire time, and they've oversubscribed memory, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I mean, this was common. Like Java is everywhere now. That was pretty set and forget. I'm making a VM. Development and the application team have told me it needs 32 gig of RAM. As much as I disagree, as much as I don't want to dedicate that RAM to it, I'm going to do it. But then I'm going to walk away and go do the rest of my day job. But I mean, that doesn't hold true with Kubernetes. You go look at a manifest file for an application, and there's a multitude of parameters that need to be set up to ensure that A, it gets the resources it needs, B, it doesn't use more resources than what it could need, and then take out your entire cluster because you've got some app that's gone haywire and it's just using all the available resources on the nodes that you have running in your cluster. So all of a sudden, the people that were just like, hey, I'm running apps on a VM, this is really simple. There's a much greater need for them to be aware of how that application is actually operating. Right? It's that glue that's now sticking the two together that developers and application support teams need to learn about, know about, and do. And the operations teams also need to pay a lot more attention because it's critical, right? It's not just like VMware, let's just over allocate and live with the consequences. If you do that in Kubernetes, you're going to have an outage, a long outage. As you go through, find all those manifests, figure out what's set, what's not set, retune, rebaseline. And if you do that in a silo as an operations team, DevOps, platform ops, all of a sudden, you're going to have things that are manifesting that are impacting your customers,
So
right?
then you're talking about setting like certain you do like requests and limits, right? Like so you're
Yeah.
setting requests, you're setting limits. Like that's something that you run into with like Jupyter notebooks and that kind of stuff too. Like it has a set amount it needs, and then you want to make sure it doesn't keep going because it'll take up as much as it can to get that job run
Yeah.
fast. So
Yeah.
you're like,
But if you set that limit arbitrarily and you don't tell the application or the engineers, but then all of a sudden they're like, oh, login's running really slowly today. What changed? Nobody knows. So the application team's going to go start looking through their code and opening up some, tickets with their engineering team, like what happened in the last release, not knowing that a DevOps admin was like, oh, it's using too much RAM. Here's a limit, save, patch, done, walk away.
or the test environment, they're just running without limits, but then they get into production and then they're like, oh no, everything's limited. You
Yeah.
can't take up too much. Well, I remember like back in like 2012, it was funny because you talk about like, oh, I just need 32 gigs of memory arbitrarily. Like I don't know why. I would get requests as a VMware admin. Hey, can you give me a 512 gigabyte memory server? I was like, it doesn't work that way. I don't have that much. I don't have that much on a single server. I can't just throw like 512 to you. Even if I oversub, that's more than like 2x of what I have, right? Like they're just like, oh, I just got to do all this stuff, but I got to work on this. I was like, I can give you like 32 or like maybe like 48 or something like that, and then I can give you maybe like 200 to 500 gigs of storage, but I can't give you like this is virtualization. I don't have this huge computer just to give to just you. I was like,
I'm not giving you the entire host.
yeah, basically.
Right. I just spent $30,000 on this piece of hardware, a bucket load of money on VMware licensing. Yeah. And then some app team is like, yeah, we need the entirety of it.
It
Yeah.
works perfectly now.
That was a big thing. Like my old product Foglight that's written in Java, it could, if it was looking at an environment with say like 30,000 virtual machines and it's collecting metrics, every minute, that's a lot of data, right? A lot of data. So
You're starting to have to plan for networking stuff too, just to get that to work, right? Like,
well, I mean, one time the engineering team came back and was like, so we did some rough calculations for one installation to support 30,000 virtual machines. I'm like, guys, those resources are too high. we need to make this code a lot more efficient. Because I'm not going to a customer and saying, hey, I'm going to take half of your ESX iHost to run a VM to monitor the virtual environment. Like, that makes the cost of that software pretty expensive, because it's like, wow, you've got half of one of my $20,000 blade servers. Like, no thanks. But yeah, look, if you're running Kubernetes, you're going to hit these problems. Then you're going to hit them running cloud, like a native cluster, and you're going to hit them running an EKS cluster. That's not going to solve those issues. That's when you need someone to help, consultancy, someone like Platform 9. There's other options out there. Upstream, Ask Slack, community boards.
See, oftentimes too, if you're new to it, you're not going to know that's what the problem is, right? Like, I'll go back to the Jupyter notebook. Like, I just kept getting kernel kept dying, but I didn't know what was causing it. I'm like, am I not giving enough CPU? So I have to test that. Am I not giving enough memory? It was because I had set the memory limit to 4 gigs, and it needed at least 5 to 6. So it would hit that limit and just break. And it wasn't designed in a way to where it would be like, okay, I can just exist with this. It's like, I need more.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's still infrastructure related issues, right? Just because you're in the cloud doesn't mean you can just be like, I don't have to learn anything. Do I use IP tables or IPVS? Should I use the EKS CNI that's native to AWS, or should I use something like Calico? Can I do BGP? If you've got a large distributed application, you might want to look into how that can give you better performance. But then it's like, okay, I'm going to use Calico. I've got more than 50 nodes. What does that mean? Well, that means you need dedicated route reflectors. If you don't have dedicated route reflectors, then you then have every node in your cluster trying to update the routing table for BGP amongst everyone. That has catastrophic outcomes, right?
Like, which service mesh should I use? There's 100 of them. Like, everyone's coming out with it every week.
You choose EKS CNI. Now you have very well documented. If you are on EKS and you are wondering where to see this, it is available, published in GitHub from Amazon. Each instance type has an elastic network interface limit that gives you pod limits. So you could be looking at an instance type in AWS and thinking, this feels right for running my environment. And you think, I can fit 50 pods for each of these instances based on like rough historic data in an Excel spreadsheet. What you need to bring into account there is using the EKS CNI, how many pods can actually be running on that node at one time? Because if you calculate 50, but because of the way the CNI operates, it's actually 38. Well, now you've got a problem. Your math is not going to work.
And it's gonna hit, like, the issue's gonna hit when you're scaling up and you probably need it most, and then you're sitting there trying to figure out what's working.
Yeah. You're getting busy. Marketing's gone out and been like, we did this great live stream. Let's promote it. You're getting all these great signups. The DevOps team's like, oh my God, the world is burning. What's going on? I'm going to open up an AWS support ticket, and like everything's working fine. The problem's in your app, and you're like, wait a second, no, my app's fine. It's the infrastructure problem. And as I described with VMware, it's now worse. You need to understand like a lot more of the stack, as well as that the way that the manifest impacts the way an application's running. So you've got multiple layers to be paying attention to.
I'm sure as people scale and people use the cloud more often, they start realizing there are limits. Like, it is not a limitless resource. There are built-in limits so that you don't break things for other people and stuff like that too. So I'm sure as people scale out, a lot of them have run into it, and I've heard some interesting stories too about like how they just run into limits. Like, you're talking about pod limits, you're talking about like even like external IP addresses that you can have per like cluster. There are limits, right? Like, and you're gonna hit those limits and learn it the hard way, or like maybe be able to read about it somewhere else and figure out beforehand. But there's limits you're not going to have maybe on bare metal locally, right? Like, not the same thing. So let's move into I know we're getting close to time. We're going pretty good. We'll see if we have any questions. If you have questions, go ahead and post some questions. We can answer them. But I'll move on to the next topic. Are there use cases? You kind of touched on it before. Are there use cases better suited to either? Like, is there a use case better suited to a EKS cluster versus a native cluster? Like, maybe like you have to have more control and access to the control plane for logging, or
I mean, the first one I touched on was consistency.
Okay.
You're running hybrid, or let's even say you're going multi-cloud. That's another good reason to go native. So you have consistent across all those cloud providers. Um, Even using someone like Rackspace or a DigitalOcean, you didn't want to use their Kubernetes service, right? Um, if you want to use those bleeding edge features, then this is going to be your only option. Um, to me, they're kind of the biggest reasons to do it. Are there advantages to one or the other? Um, I mean, if you're doing DIY upstream open source, the burden of running that control plane is going to be significantly higher than just using EKS, AKS, or GKE. That's for sure. So you could sort of say that's a detractor. Like there's more you have to manage. Um, the the infrastructure you're provisioning for that, if you're not running the control plane nodes for a value add, right? You're just doing it for pure joy and 2 a.m. wake up calls. Then you're going to be paying for those 3, 5 nodes that are running the control plane services that are hosting at CD. You're going to be paying for those services. They're running. And if you've got 25 clusters, then all of a sudden you have 25 by 5. And you're paying for those resources, right? So if you're doing this, I would say that you want to be doing it for a good reason.
Gotcha. So you're saying like maybe I've got a bunch of on-prem stuff and I'm running bare metal. I want to make sure that everything that I've got running internally reflects what I'm running in the cloud. It could be beneficial to run my own control plane there and have the exact version of everything that I'm using without worrying about EKS not being able to support. I mean, a lot of stuff you're just going to install it afterwards, right? Like a lot of stuff you install after you've got Kubernetes running, but some of the feature sets that are involved with EKS may be different than you want. Like you could theoretically set up a bare metal node, or you set up nodes on EKS or not EKS, but Amazon and run metal LB if you're running that locally, so that everything's exactly the same. You're running the same ingress controller. It's like that's kind of a benefit. But then like yeah, if you're running everything on Amazon and you're not using anything else, then like there's probably no real reason to maybe run your own control plane unless you get to a certain point where there's a
Yeah,
requirement.
I, yeah, I would think the majority of the users wouldn't, right? And this is why the hyperscalers just obfuscate them, right? It makes a lot of sense, right? When we do a native cluster or something on-prem using Pair OS, the control plane's there, and it can be customized. We've got a few customers that really push the limits, push the boundaries, and say, "Hey, I'm going to change X," and we'll work with you to do that, right? But they're once again they're the ones that are really looking at what's coming upstream, looking at what's new in each release, and then putting that into a lower environment and saying, "Hey, how does this help me operationalize my applications?" Oops, no, that was a bad idea. Let's roll that back. But for the majority of customers, we're saying, look, it's there, it's tuned. We have everything. It's in our control planes in our doc site, right? If you want to go and look at what we're setting and how we're doing it, it's there.
So one of the things too about like moving into Amazon is you might be hiring a full-time person that's just managing identity and access management, because you're going to have some of the engineers be like, I don't want to deal with that. Like I don't want to interact with that. I remember getting started with it in a previous life, and it's just it's so much overhead to where like I just didn't want to deal with it. Right? Like
Yeah, I mean, you could say I'm going to go OIDC with EKS. It has that, right? And use that as one of the chaining methods of authentication, which means that the users don't have access to AWS. They have access to the EKS cluster. But now you're saying, how do I map users to roles and cluster role bindings, right? Kubernetes is not aware of the groups, but it knows how to validate the user, and then it all goes into RBAC, and you need to go solve that problem yourself. So it's one way of alleviating having to do everything in AWS, but it's not going to solve your kubeconfig distribution problem. It's not going to refresh it. It's not going to give you, token management that you can revoke. It's not going to simplify role-based access control. And it's not going to give you the tooling that you need to put out there and distribute to all of your users that need cluster access, right?
I think we're getting to time there, Chris. Do you have any additional words of wisdom or closing thoughts or anything before I let everybody know how they can get in touch with us?
Words of wisdom.
Yeah,
It's Friday, right? The weekend is coming. Words of wisdom.
that's right.
Enjoy, have fun, get out, do something, move. Um, yeah, that would be my word of wisdom. Find a fun wine, hang out with friends.
All right, so we're gonna do these every week on Friday. If you want, you can join us on Slack. There's the Slack information. Join Slack. It'll put you in the general channel. I'm posting information there that you can see about the next one coming up. If you want to talk about the show, you can jump in State of Cloud Native. And if you want to just reach out to me directly or get one of our wizards connected to you, you can just talk to me at M Petersen. But thank you so much for your time, Chris. I
No
hope
worries.
everybody got something out of this. See y'all next Friday.